So welcome everyone. This is David J. Kent. I am because of the release of my new book, Lincoln in New England, In Search of His Forgotten Tours. I'm just doing a series of videos. I'm going to give some background about Lincoln's relationship with each state, one state per video. So I've done Maine, I've done Vermont, and today we're doing Massachusetts. Now, Lincoln had only gone to New England twice in his life, uh, and unlike Maine and Vermont that he did not go to, he did go to Massachusetts. In fact, he spent almost 2 weeks there in 1848. So here's Lincoln. He's in the House of Representatives, his single term as a congressman, but there are two sessions of that term of Congress. And in between the sessions, Lincoln was asked to go up to Massachusetts to campaign for the Whig nominee for president, who was Zachary Taylor. So I dig into this for a great deal of the first half of the book. So I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but I just did want to give you a little bit of highlights and some background. So Lincoln, in fact, in 1861, once he's in in the White House, he gets a visit from one of the people he met on this 1848 trip, and he recalls this trip. And he says, I had been chosen to Congress then and from the Wild West, and with hayseed in my hair, I went to Massachusetts to take a few lessons in deportment. So it gives you an idea of how he was taken. He was this Western rube, Western sucker Whig from the far west frontier that didn't have a lot of education. He was somebody that told jokes. But other than that, the people in New England hadn't heard of this guy. They had no idea who he was. So they basically was there for entertainment value for these much more sophisticated, you know, Massachusetts people. So that's kind of how he was taken. But he did learn a lot on this trip. He learned some of the things that were going to split the Whig Party in within a few years. The split off of some of the Whigs into the Free Soilers, the difference between conscience Whigs and cotton Whigs, and the fact that instead of just mild, moderate anti-slavery, there was fervent abolitionism growing in Massachusetts in particular and in New England that would even grow even faster and harder after the 1850. So all of these things he's picking up. Now, there's so many connections in these 2 weeks worth of trips into New England, into Massachusetts, that it's impossible to cover everybody in detail. But I just want to hit some of the highlights, hit some of the few people. So there are politicians like Henry Wilson, who becomes a senator. He was one of the people who split off into this Free Soilers, but he was also one of the people who helped start the Republican Party in Massachusetts. There were people like Charles Francis Adams. Now, if name sounds familiar, it's because he was the son of John Quincy Adams. He was the grandson of John Adams. He was he would go on to have a career himself, although he didn't become president like his ancestors. It was Charles Sumner, who everybody has heard of, huge senator from Massachusetts. John Quincy Adams himself, in fact, Lincoln met. After he had been president, he had gotten himself elected to the House of Representatives. And he died, had a stroke, and died in the House chambers with Lincoln literally a few steps away. In fact, Lincoln was on the committee to plan his funeral. There were people like Daniel Webster, huge name, who was also there at that time and very important. Um, but there's one more person that becomes politician who's become very important that Lincoln meets in this first time for the first time in Boston. His last speech in Boston, Lincoln is actually speaking immediately after William Henry Seward, who was already had been a governor of New York, was already a Whig leader, and he was quite a contrast because he's very high educated versus Lincoln's not very much educated. So there are quite a bit of people that he met during this time. But there were also other key people during this trip. There were abolitionists. William Lloyd Garrison, born in Newburyport, just near my hometown, uh, started his newspaper, The Liberator, in Boston in 1831. He was a huge abolitionist and very vociferous, very fervent in his abolitionism. There were also people like Wendell Phillips, also, who didn't get along with Lincoln. And yet, Lincoln eventually would meet Garrison and Phillips and another abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, all of whom have connections to Massachusetts and mostly were in Massachusetts. For Frederick Douglass, we think of him as Rochester, New York, and Washington. But after he escaped slavery in Maryland, he went to New York City briefly, got married, changed his name to Johnson, moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he changed his name to Frederick Douglass. So, in the very same building, the very same hall that William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass and other hardcore abolitionists gave abolitionist speeches, is the same building that Lincoln gave his speech in when he went to New Bedford on this 1848 trip. Another man that you may not have heard of that was a big abolitionist is Theodore Parker. He was more of a behind the scenes guy, but he helped arrange a lot of this abolitionism. In fact, he was one of the Secret Six that had helped out John Brown. Lincoln has this indirect correspondence with Theodore Parker through William Herndon. These were people who wanted to get rid of slavery immediately and including in the South, which was quite a contrast for Lincoln. Lincoln, now we don't know that he met him in 1848, but he certainly met Garrison and Phillips and Douglass later on in the White House. There were other more moderate anti-slavery advocates, like more along the lines of Lincoln. These are the transcendentalist writers in Concord, Massachusetts: Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Louisa May Alcott, and then their wives and sisters and mothers who were part of the female anti-slavery societies that existed at this time, all pushing for the end of slavery. And some of these, again, Lincoln would meet Emerson and Hawthorne in the White House during the Civil War. There was another interesting connection here that was about Lincoln, is that when he was in Congress, he started researching his family history. He didn't know much about his family history prior to that, but after he gave his spot resolution speech about the Mexican War, he received a letter from a Solomon Lincoln living in Hingham, Massachusetts. And Ed Steers, calls Hingham, it says it's a town full of Lincolns. There were Lincolns all over the place. And that's because Hingham was where the American part of Lincoln's family heritage came from. They had moved from Hingham, England to Hingham, Massachusetts. Samuel Lincoln there's Samuel Lincoln houses in Hingham. Samuel Lincoln is the direct ancestor of Abraham Lincoln. And I mentioned in the Vermont video that right across the street is Benjamin Lincoln, who was important in the Revolutionary War. He's a couple of Lincolns removed from Lincoln. So after getting the letter from Solomon, he starts correspondence with Solomon, and he ends up corresponding with Solomon, with David, with Richard, with Austin, with Davis. All of these are Lincolns in various places, Pennsylvania and Virginia. So he's trying to track down his family while he's doing this tour and afterwards. I mentioned in the main video that Enoch Lincoln was the governor of Maine at one point. His brother Levi Jr. was the governor of Massachusetts for a long time. Well, Lincoln, when he was in Worcester, his very first speech on this 1848 tour, to try to convince Free Soilers to stay in the fold, he had dinner with Levi Lincoln Jr., who is part of this Samuel Lincoln line. Well, Levi Lincoln Jr. had a big party, and he had dinner, and he had quite a list of the Massachusetts leaders, political leaders at the time. Not only was he already had been a former governor, but there were 3 future governors in that room. There were also a couple of people that maybe people haven't heard of but are very close to me because Rufus Choate and Robert C. Winthrop are both part of families that are very prominent in my hometown. Robert Winthrop was from the Winthrop family that were the originators. John Winthrop was the first colonial governor of Massachusetts, and his son, John Winthrop Jr., or the younger, was the founder of my hometown of Ipswich in Massachusetts. So these are all people that are either, some of them are directly important to Lincoln, and others are peripheral in the sense that they were related to this trip. One other person from this party or this dinner that I'll mention is George Ashmun. So probably you remember the name George Ashmun. He was a congressman. He also is the man who presided over the 1860 Republican convention that had nominated Lincoln. And for those who study Lincoln a little closer, they'll remember the name George Ashmun, the very last person that Lincoln spoke to on the evening of April 14th, 1865. George had come to talk to him about some issue, and Lincoln says, I'm late. I got to get to the theater. I'm going to Ford's Theater. I need to go. Here's my card. Writes on it, please admit Mr. Ashmun first thing on the morning of April 15th. And of course, that meeting never happened. So to wrap this up, there's a couple other things that are interesting about Massachusetts. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the United States Colored Troops, made famous in the movie Glory. That that regiment, led by Robert Gould Shaw, there's a huge statue, bas relief statue of that, done by Augustus St. Gaudens, the sculptor, who sculpted a couple of statues that are famous in Chicago. But he also sculpted this Robert Gould Shaw Memorial, which sits directly on the side of the street, directly across from the Massachusetts State House. Now, I think people have heard, some people at least in the Northeast have heard that Boston is called the Hub. So it's called the Hub because Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., not Jr., who was the justice, but Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. wrote a poem, wrote a story, and he said that the Massachusetts State House was the hub of the solar system. And Boston liked this concept, so they said, well, okay, the State House is the hub of the solar system, while the city of Boston is the hub of the universe. And I think Massachusetts as a whole considers itself the hub of the universe. And the hub caught on. If you know anything about Boston sports, the Boston Red Sox have an emblem that's this round little emblem that looks like a spoked wheel from a wagon. And right in the hub of that is a big B for the Boston Bruins. So that hub of the universe thing started there. The last thing I'll mention is in Western Massachusetts, Lincoln didn't get out there. He was mostly in the East. But in Western Massachusetts, since I'm talked about sculptors, David Chester French had a studio out in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, out in the West. That studio is partially where he designed and the sculpture that is the Lincoln Memorial sculpture of Lincoln. There's also out there, by the way, there's a Norman Rockwell Museum. Norman Rockwell, the painter, was very much a fan of Abraham Lincoln. And one of his famous paintings, he has several things about Lincoln. One of his famous paintings is this very tall, thin painting, Lincoln in a white suit, being a lawyer, called Lincoln for the Defense, which is it's a great painting. If you haven't been out there, you should get there. So that's basically it. Obviously, I talk about Massachusetts in this 1848 trip and how Lincoln was taken about during this trip. A lot in the book. The first half of the book deals with 1848. The second half of the book deals with 1860. And Lincoln didn't give any speeches in Massachusetts then. He was in other states. He did pass through Boston. He changed trains in Boston when he was going from Providence, Rhode Island to Exeter, New Hampshire. And there was one other time when he was in New Hampshire, he had to go from Manchester, New Hampshire to Dover. But in order to get from Manchester, New Hampshire to Dover, New Hampshire, you have to go south changed trains in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and then back north to Manchester. So he did make a couple of quickie little appearances in Massachusetts in 1860. So I talk about the 1860 trip in later in the book. So the next video I'll do is about Rhode Island, which is the first place he gave a speech in his 1860 trip. So thank you, and tune back for the next video, which will be the next night.